When I staggered into courtroom 4 of the Savannah District Courthouse, my own son didn't even look up from his phone. Julian merely smirked, a cold, clinical twist of his lips, while my daughter-in-law, Meredith, shook her head with open, unadulterated contempt. I was wearing a faded, oversized plaid shirt, worn-out denim trousers, and scuffed leather work boots that smelled of damp soil. In my trembling hands, I clutched a battered canvas gardening hat and an old, scratched Swiss mechanical music box, the last tangible piece of my deceased husband, Arthur. To the rest of the world, I looked like a textbook case of rapid-onset dementia, a confused, unkempt old woman who had wandered out of her mind and into a legal slaughterhouse. I heard Meredith whisper something to Julian. He let out a low, choked laugh, a sound so sharp it cut through my chest like a rusty blade. To them, I was no longer a mother. I was an embarrassment, an inconvenience, a senile old fool who had no business holding on to a $15 million historic estate in Martha's Vineyard. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, a sudden spike of pure adrenaline fighting against the heavy, artificial lethargy coursing through my veins. Every breath felt like inhaling wet sand. I forced my knees to shake, letting my posture slump forward into the exact shape of defeat they had spent weeks manufacturing. But then, the heavy double doors at the front of the room swung open. Judge Gregory Mitchell stepped onto the elevated mahogany bench. As he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defense table, his eyes met mine. I watched with calculated precision as the color drained from his face. The professional, sympathetic mask of a seasoned judge completely vanished, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the sound block with a dull, echoing clatter that shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. He physically recoiled into his high-backed leather chair, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. The entire courtroom froze. The silence became so thick I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Julian stopped smiling. Meredith frowned, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around her designer handbag as she stared at the bench. Judge Mitchell reached up with a shaking hand, removing his glasses, his lips moving as he whispered something that silenced the entire gallery. "My God," he breathed, his voice thin and breathless without the need for a microphone. "Is it really her?" They had no idea who I truly was, not until that exact fraction of a second. They saw a decaying mind. He saw a legend. My name is Eleanor Caldwell. I am 68 years old. And for 30 years, I was the most ruthless, brilliant, and honorable federal family and asset protection judge this state had ever seen. I didn't just know the law. I wrote the very statutes my children were currently trying to use to lock me away. But as I stood there, playing the part of a broken matriarch, I realized my flawless countertrap had one catastrophic flaw. The high-priced litigator Julian had hired, a slick city lawyer with slicked-back hair, cleared his throat, trying to break the heavy spell hanging over the room. "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, his smooth cadence faltering, "if I may direct the court's attention to the emergency ex parte conservatorship petition. We have temporary order approvals, and more importantly, we have the co-signature of the respondent's designated primary legal trustee." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, a sensation far more freezing than the autumn rain lashing against the courtroom windows. My eyes shifted slightly to the side. Sitting at the far corner of the plaintiff's table, stepping out of the shadows, was David Sterling. David, my personal attorney for 2 decades, the man who had helped me set up my private trusts, the man I had called from my locked room at the Silver Linings Asylum using my hidden burner phone. The one person I trusted with the digital encrypted files containing the surveillance footage of my son robbing my safe. David wouldn't look me in the eye. He adjusted his silk tie, his face fixed in a mask of cold, bureaucratic detachment, and handed a certified document to the bailiff. "The trustee coordinates with the petitioners," David announced, his voice steady, delivering a fatal blow straight into my spine. "As the legal custodian of the Caldwell estate, I concur with the medical affidavits. Eleanor Caldwell is no longer competent to manage her assets. For her own safety, the permanent conservatorship must be granted to her son Julian immediately." Meredith's smirk returned, sharper and more vicious this time. She leaned over the table, her eyes locking onto mine, her lips moving in a silent, triumphant mockery. "You're done." I sank into my wooden chair, letting the battered canvas hat drop to the floor. The trap hadn't just sprung on them. David had altered the triggers. My evidence, my security feeds, my entire life work, the hams of my defense, were currently sitting in the hands of the man who had just sold me out to the highest bidder. I looked down at the scratched wood of the table, forcing a pathetic, trembling whimper to escape my lips. But behind the veil of my messy, uncombed gray hair, the fear evaporated. The helpless widow vanished. The cold, calculating mind of a supreme judge locked into place. David had the files, but he didn't know about the independent toxicology report currently mailed to a private, unregistered P.O. box under a fake name. He didn't know that 3 days ago, I had intentionally swallowed the poison my daughter-in-law put in my tea, just so my blood would hold the undeniable proof of their corporate execution. They thought they had executed the perfect white-collar execution. They thought they had backed the old lioness into a corner, stripped her of her pride, her fortune, and her freedom. Slowly, without anyone noticing, my left hand reached down into the deep interior pocket of my oversized flannel shirt. My fingers brushed against the cold, jagged metal of my husband's diamond Tram Kai tuck, the sharp edge piercing into my thumb, the tiny sting of pain keeping me anchored through the chemical fog of the drugs. I didn't protest. I didn't shout. I merely let my lower lip tremble, looking up at Judge Mitchell with a gaze of manufactured terror, waiting for the legal slaughter to officially begin. It all started exactly 5 weeks ago, on a quiet, fog-covered afternoon at my estate in Martha's Vineyard. An afternoon when the music in my home was brutally turned off and the shadows inside my own walls began to move. 1:55. The tightening knot, the ice of Martha's Vineyard. The memory of that autumn fog in Martha's Vineyard rolled over me like a suffocating shroud, bleeding seamlessly into the sterile chill of courtroom 4. 5 weeks ago, the Atlantic wind had felt like jagged shards of glass against my skin as I stood at the edge of my porch, watching the gray waves crash against the cliffs. I remember thinking how quiet the world had become since Arthur passed away 2 years prior. This estate, with its weathered cedar shingles and generations of family history, was supposed to be my final sanctuary, a place where I could listen to the delicate mechanics of Arthur's Swiss music box and feel his presence in the silence. Instead, it had become a hunting ground. My eyes remained fixed on David Sterling, my trusted attorney, who was still presenting his betrayal to the judge. Looking at his unyielding silhouette, a bittersweet ache pierced through my chest. I couldn't help but remember the sheer devotion I had poured into my son, Julian. When Arthur died, I didn't just mourn a husband. I shielded Julian from the brutal realities of the financial world. I had funded his first 3 business ventures with my own capital, clearing his debts without a single question, because he was my blood. I had believed his tears when he swore he wanted to protect his grieving mother. I had gladly handed over the complex management of the Caldwell Family Trust to his wife, Meredith, believing her background in hedge funds would safeguard our legacy. I had loved him with the fierce, blind instinct of a matriarch, and this was the return on my investment. That quiet afternoon 5 weeks ago was the day the illusion finally shattered. I had walked down the long gravel driveway to the mailbox, my hands buried in the pockets of my cashmere coat. Among the routine utility bills and architectural magazines, there was a thick ivory envelope with a bold crimson stamp on the front. Final notice of delinquency, intent to foreclose. My breath caught in my throat. The document, issued by the Dukes County tax assessor, stated that the property taxes on the Caldwell estate were 90 days past due. A balance of $75,000 was outstanding, and if it wasn't settled by the end of the month, the county would seize the house. My home, the place where my grandchildren were supposed to run through the gardens. It was mathematically impossible. Exactly 30 days prior, I had signed a wire transfer of $85,000 directly into the corporate account managed by Meredith. She had sat at my dining table, sipped my Earl Grey tea, and patted my hand, promising that the taxes were fully settled. "Don't stress your retired mind with paperwork, Mother," she had whispered with that flawless, practiced sweetness. "Julian and I have everything under control." My hands didn't shake then. My heart didn't race. the cold, analytical mind of a federal judge simply locked into place. I pulled out my phone and dialed Julian's number. He answered on the third ring, the background noise echoing with the clinking of crystal glasses and laughter from a high-end restaurant in Manhattan. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice as level and measured as a courtroom verdict. "I am standing in the driveway holding a foreclosure notice for the estate. I transferred the tax funds to Meredith 4 weeks ago. Explain this to me." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end. The background noise seemed to abruptly muffle, as if he had stepped into a private hallway. When he spoke, his voice carried a patronizing warmth that immediately turned my stomach. "Mother, please calm down," he said, his tone dripping with the manufactured pity one uses to soothe a hysterical child. "You're getting yourself worked up over a delayed, automated letter. You know how slow the county bureaucracy is. Meredith paid that weeks ago. Just go inside, pour yourself some tea, and rest. We'll drive down tonight and sort out your confusion." They arrived just after sunset. The headlights of Julian's sleek black Aston Martin swept across the front porch where I sat waiting. Meredith stepped out first, draped in a pristine camel hair coat, clutching a designer handbag, her face set in an expression of exhausted patience. Julian followed, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket, looking entirely unbothered by the gravity of the situation. I invited them into the library, placing the ivory foreclosure notice squarely on the antique mahogany desk. "Show me the bank confirmation receipt, Meredith," I stated, my eyes locking onto hers. "Right now." Meredith didn't even glance at the paper. She let out a dramatic, weary sigh and threw her handbag onto my sofa with an arrogant ease that made the leather creak. "Eleanor, honestly, this is becoming a pattern," Meredith said smoothly, stepping into my personal space. She reached out and deliberately shut the lid of Arthur's mechanical music box, cutting off the faint, elegant melody of the opera solo that had been playing. "Julian and I are doing you a massive favor by managing these accounts for free. But lately, you are forgetting everything. Your mind is playing tricks on you." "My vision is perfectly clear, Meredith," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "The document is dated 3 days ago. It explicitly states no payment has been received." Julian stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder, not out of comfort, but to physically press me down into my chair. "Mother, stop interrogating my wife," he snapped, his voice rising just enough to dominate the room. "You are confused. Do you not realize how bad your memory has gotten this month? Last week you forgot the name of the estate's landscaper. 2 days ago you called me asking what day of the week it was. And yesterday..." He paused, exchanging a quick, exasperated look with Meredith. It was a look that screamed, "Here we go again with the senile old woman." "Yesterday," Meredith picked up the narrative, her eyes cold and unyielding, "Julian and I stopped by while you were napping. The master bathroom faucet was left running at full pressure. The water was overflowing, ruining the antique floorboards. The entire hallway was damp. You could have flooded the structural foundations of this house, Eleanor. We had to turn off the main water valve ourselves." The library went dead silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. I stared at my son and his wife, feeling a chilling realization wash over me. The water valve. For a fraction of a second, a normal grieving widow might have doubted herself. She might have panicked, visualized the running water, and wept over her failing mind. But they had forgotten who they were dealing with. I had spent 3 decades on the federal bench evaluating the micro-expressions of pathological liars and white-collar sociopaths. I knew the exact physical markers of a calculated deception, the slight dilation of Meredith's pupils, the rigid tension in Julian's jaw. More importantly, I knew the physical layout of my own home. I lived exclusively on the first floor now due to my mild arthritis. The upstairs master bathroom had been completely sealed off 6 months ago. I had personally watched the plumber drain the pipes and weld the secondary shut-off valve behind the drywall because I had no use for it. It was physically impossible for that faucet to have been running yesterday. They weren't trying to help me. They were deliberately, systematically lying to my face. They were gaslighting me. My maternal instinct screamed at me to slam my gavel onto the desk, to strip them of their dignity, to demand my $85,000 back and cast them out of my sight. But my legal training overrode the rage. It was cold, calculating, and patient. If I confronted them now without irrefutable ironclad proof, they would escalate their narrative. They would use my anger, my outrage, as further evidence of my supposed mental instability. To win this war, I had to let them believe their lie was working. I had to compress the spring. I let my shoulders slump forward. I forced my chin to drop, imitating the posture of a defeated, broken senior citizen. I let my voice crack with a carefully manufactured vulnerability. I left the water running? I murmured, staring blankly at the floorboards. I don't remember going upstairs at all. Yes, Mother, Julian said, his voice instantly softening into that fake, sugary tone that made my flesh crawl. It terrified us. The grief of losing Dad is finally catching up to you. You can't handle the stress of this massive estate anymore. It's too much for your mind. Meredith smiled, a cold, reptilian stretch of her lips as she stepped toward the desk. Which brings us to the actual reason we came down tonight, Eleanor. Since you are clearly struggling to protect the family legacy, Julian and I have prepared a solution. A legal restructuring to take the burden off your shoulders. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents, sliding them over the foreclosure notice. My eyes scanned the text instantly, decoding the dense legalese within seconds. It was a comprehensive asset transfer agreement and a total power of attorney mandate. If I signed those pages, I would voluntarily surrender the deed to the Martha's Vineyard estate, my liquid investments, and my entire multi-million-dollar portfolio directly into the hands of Meredith's hedge fund corporate shell. But then the trap twisted into a nightmare. And to ensure there are no clerical errors moving forward, Meredith continued, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. We've already taken the liberty of freezing your primary checking accounts as your designated emergency proxies. If you look at the last page, David Sterling has already signed off as the independent trustee witness. You have no liquidity left, Eleanor. You cannot even pay your own medical bills without our authorization. Sign the transfer, and we will handle the tax delinquency. Refuse. And the county seizes this house by the end of the week, and we will have no choice but to petition for your immediate, involuntary psychiatric commitment. I stood on the precipice of a legal abyss. The sudden involvement of David Sterling, my oldest ally, was a devastating variable I hadn't prepared for. They hadn't just come to deceive me, they had legally cornered me before I could even begin my counter-investigation. If I refused to sign, they would use David's authority to lock me away immediately. If I signed, I would hand them the knife to slit my throat. I was trapped in a flawless dilemma. Meredith stepped closer, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail against the signature line. The sound clicked rhythmically in the quiet library, a mocking countdown. "Come on, Eleanor," Meredith whispered, her breath smelling faintly of expensive wine. "Don't let your stubborn pride destroy what's left of your dignity. You're an old woman who can't even remember turning off a faucet. Let us take the wheel before you ruin your son's future entirely." Julian stood behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face twisted into a sneer of absolute, undisguised arrogance. He wasn't looking at his mother with a single shred of remorse. He was looking at a financial asset that had outlived its usefulness. I looked at the pen in Meredith's hand. I looked at my son's cold eyes. The rage burning behind my eyelids was hot enough to incinerate the room, but I kept my breathing slow, shallow, and ragged. I let my hand shake visibly as I reached out, my fingers hovering over the pen, letting them feast on the absolute peak of their trou-trou and ngao man. The spring was compressed to its absolute limit. I need a few days, I whispered, letting a tear escape my eye to perfect the performance. Please, just let me sleep on it. My head feels so heavy tonight. Julian smirked, buttoning his jacket with a satisfied flick of his wrist. Fine, Mother. You have until Sunday evening. But don't bother calling David Sterling to complain. He answers to us now. Focus on your resting. We'll take care of everything. As they walked out of the library, Meredith let out a short, dismissive laugh, leaving the heavy doors wide open behind them. I stood alone in the quiet house, the silence crashing down like a thunderclap. I walked slowly over to Arthur's mechanical music box, my hands perfectly steady now, the tremors vanishing entirely. I lifted the lid, and as the delicate opera melody filled the dark room once more, my sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened, lethal resolve. They thought they had outmaneuvered a helpless widow. They thought they had used the law to execute the perfect family execution. But they had just walked into the courtroom of a supreme judge, and I was about to write an indictment they would never recover from. 3:40, the escalation, the shattered lifeline. The next morning broke with a deceptive silver stillness, the autumn frost coating the manicured lawns of my Martha's Vineyard estate like a layer of cold dust. I sat at the kitchen island, my spine perfectly straight, watching the steam rise from my untouched cup of black coffee. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. I had spent the previous night cataloging the shifting allegiances around me, assessing the damage of David Sterling's defection. In my 30 years on the federal bench, I had learned that a cornered predator never waits for a fair trial. They strike hard, they strike early, and they rely on the shock of their cruelty to paralyze their victim. Julian and Meredith were moving faster than I had anticipated, but they still believed I was navigating through a thick chemical fog. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy front door swung open without a knock. The clicking of Meredith's stiletto heels against the polished hardwood floor shattered the silence, a rhythmic, aggressive countdown that echoed through the hallway. Julian trailed behind her, his eyes glued to his smartphone, his face bearing the restless, hollow exhaustion of a man whose financial house of cards was on the verge of collapsing. Meredith marched straight into the kitchen, carrying a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. She set it down on the granite counter right next to my coffee mug with a loud, deliberate clink. Her face was masked in that counterfeit, high society concern that I had come to despise. "Good morning, Eleanor," Meredith said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she poured herself a glass of filtered water. "Julian and I were up all night worrying about you. The incident with the upper water valve, it's just proof that the isolation is rotting your short-term memory. I spoke with a private specialist out of Boston this morning, a close friend of my family, and he agreed that you need immediate neurological support. He prescribed these cognitive stabilizers. They'll help clear that nasty fog in your head." I stared at the little amber bottle. To an ordinary person, it looked innocent enough, but my cynical judicial brain, the brain that had dissected the operations of major pharmaceutical fraudsters and cartel money launderers, whispered a chilling warning. I looked closer at the small white capsules inside. "Cognitive stabilizers?" I asked, keeping my voice frail, letting it trail off into a raspy whisper. I forced my hand to reach out, letting it develop a subtle, visible tremor as my fingers brushed against the plastic cylinder. "Meredith, I've never liked taking unverified medication. My regular physician in Edgartown—" "Your regular physician doesn't understand the severity of your decline, Mother," Julian interrupted, finally looking up from his phone. He stepped forward, leaning against the kitchen island, looking down at me with an air of immense, patronizing superiority. "You almost destroyed the structural integrity of this house 2 days ago. You are in denial. Meredith is trying to save you from your own incompetence, and you're standing here arguing like a stubborn child. Take the pill, Eleanor, for your own good." "I am just so tired, Julian," I murmured, letting my eyelids heavy, letting my shoulders slump into the posture of an exhausted, defeated old woman. The foreclosure notice, the bank accounts being frozen. My mind feels like it is wading through thick mud. I just want Arthur. I want to go back to sleep. "And that is exactly why you need to trust us," Meredith said, stepping into my personal space, her eyes unyielding and cold. She unscrewed the cap, tapped a single white capsule into her palm, and pushed it toward my face. "The grief is making you senile, Eleanor. You're becoming a danger to yourself and a massive liability to this family's legacy. If you don't start cooperating with your medical regimen, Julian and I will have no choice but to accelerate the involuntary commitment process. We have David Sterling's signature as the trustee. You are completely isolated. Now take the medicine." The psychological pressure was immense, a calculated execution of gaslighting designed to make a vulnerable senior break down, weep, and surrender their autonomy. But behind the veil of my uncombed gray hair, my mind was operating with absolute razor-sharp lucidity. I knew what those pills were. Thanks to my covert coordination with a trusted medical contact, I knew they were a high-dosage generic formulation of a potent neuroleptic, an antipsychotic drug meant for severe schizophrenia. Introducing such heavy chemicals into a healthy 68-year-old brain would rapidly mimic the late stages of dementia, causing severe tremors, profound confusion, and an artificial mental paralysis that would trap me inside my own failing body. They weren't trying to clear the fog. They were manufacturing it. They were trying to erase me legally and medically so they could cede my $15 million estate to their creditors before I could block them. I knew I had to maintain the facade to buy time. I let out a ragged, pathetic sigh, took the capsule from Meredith's hand, and placed it in my mouth. I picked up my mug of black coffee, took a large gulp, and swallowed hard, making sure she saw the movement of my throat. In reality, I utilized a simple courtroom defense trick I've seen desperate inmates use. I trapped the capsule securely beneath the thick band of my lower left gums, shielding it with my cheek. Meredith watched my throat move with clinical satisfaction. She patted my shoulder with a cold, hesitant hand. "Good girl, Eleanor. You see? That wasn't so hard. Julian and I will check on you this evening. Just stay in the library, keep off your feet, and let the medication do its work." The moment their luxury car crunched back down the gravel driveway, I sprinted to the bathroom and spat the chemical poison into the toilet, flushing it away. I stood in front of the mirror, my hands perfectly steady, my breathing deep and measured. The spring was compressing. The anger inside my chest had solidified into a sheet of pure, tactical ice. I needed to act. I walked into my study, pulled a cheap, prepaid cellular phone, purchased with cash 2 days prior, from its hiding spot inside a hollowed-out legal encyclopedia, and dialed the one lifeline I had left. Her name was Evelyn Vance. She was a retired Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, my dearest friend from our days at Harvard Law, and the only person in the state who possessed the legal stature and the absolute loyalty required to dismantle a conspiracy of this magnitude. I had left her an encrypted digital file containing preliminary evidence of Julian's financial fraud 48 hours ago. She was supposed to be filing an emergency federal injunction to unfreeze my bank accounts this morning. The line rang 4 times before a tight, unfamiliar voice answered. It wasn't Evelyn. "Hello? Who is this?" the voice asked, sharp and strained. "My name is Eleanor Caldwell," I said, a sudden knot of tension tightening in my stomach. "I need to speak with Justice Vance immediately. Is she available?" There was a long, suffocating pause on the other end. I could hear the background noise of a busy, echoing corridor, the sound of medical monitors, rushing footsteps, and low whispers. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is Evelyn's daughter, Sarah," the voice said, her tone cracking with sudden, overwhelming grief. "I'm so sorry. My mother was involved in a catastrophic car accident late last night on her way back from her Boston office. A heavy commercial truck T-boned her vehicle at an intersection. She's currently in the intensive care unit at Massachusetts General. She's in a medically induced coma, Eleanor. The doctors don't know if she's going to make it through the night." The words hit me like a physical blow, stripping the oxygen straight from my lungs. The room seemed to spin slightly, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounding like a mocking laugh. "An accident?" I whispered, my voice genuinely cracking this time, the cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. "Sarah, did the police find out what happened to the truck driver?" "He fled the scene, Eleanor," Sarah sobbed. "The vehicle was reported stolen 3 hours before the crash. The police have no leads. They're calling it a random hit and run. But they found her briefcase open in the back seat. All her legal documents, her laptop, her personal files, they were all missing." I closed my eyes, the chilling reality of the situation settling over my bones like a sheet of solid ice. It wasn't a random accident. It was a targeted extraction. Julian and Meredith's shadow creditors, the Chicago banking syndicate that Julian owed $15 million to, had caught wind of Evelyn's investigation. They had tracked her, crushed her vehicle, and stolen the evidence before she could ever step foot inside a federal courthouse. My primary alliance was decimated. My legal shield was gone. My evidence was incinerated. My checking accounts were frozen. My trusted attorney had sold me out, and my son was actively poisoning my body. I was completely, utterly alone, trapped on an isolated island with the wolves circling my porch. For the first time since Arthur died, a wave of pure, unadulterated terror threatened to swallow me whole. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling now, not because of a performance, but from the raw, primitive shock of absolute vulnerability. I was a 68-year-old widow facing a ruthless, multi-state criminal syndicate, and my own flesh and blood was holding the door open for them. I hung up the phone slowly, letting the cheap plastic device slide onto the mahogany desk. The silence of the estate crashed down on me, heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly permanent. The trap had closed, and I was sitting squarely in the dark, with no one left to hear me scream. 5:20, the simulated collapse, the silent counter-ambush. The cold plastic of the burner phone remained pressed against my ear long after the line went dead, the static hiss echoing through the library, like the sound of retreating tides. The news of Evelyn's accident, her shattered body lying in a sterile Boston ICU, her files stolen, clutched at my chest with an icy grip. But as a former federal judge, I knew that panic was a luxury of the amateur. Fear was a chemical reaction. Control was a calculated choice. I lowered the phone, my eyes tracking a single autumn leaf scraping frantically against the window pane. Julian and his Chicago Shadow Syndicate believed they had just severed my last carotid artery. They believed that by crushing Evelyn, they had left me entirely naked, blind, and defenseless. They had no idea that in the brutal game of federal prosecution, a seasoned investigator never stores the primary indictment in a single briefcase. I stood up, my spine cracking slightly, the stiffness in my knees reminding me of my 68 years. But my gaze remained fixed on the space between the floorboards beneath the antique Persian rug where my safe was hidden. If David Sterling had turned, if Evelyn's legal shield was gone, then the conventional court system was no longer a safe harbor. I had to let them think the execution was complete. To catch a predator who operates from the shadows, you must not only play the bait, you must pretend to be a corpse. The opportunity to test this tactical retreat arrived precisely 48 hours later, on a bleak Sunday evening. The heavy oak doors of the estate didn't just open. They bounced against the wall as Julian and Meredith strode inside, flanked by David Sterling. David carried a thick leather portfolio, his eyes darting away from mine, refusing to hold the gaze of the woman who had paid his firm's retainers for 2 decades. Meredith didn't even bother removing her coat. Her face was alive with a restless, predatory electricity. She looked like a gambler who knew the wheel was about to stop on her number. "Eleanor," Meredith said, her voice dropping into that loud, artificial cadence used to address someone whose mind had completely dissolved. She walked over to the grandfather clock, running a gloved finger along the polished wood, before turning to face me. "We've seen the reports from the Silver Lining staff. We know you've been wandering into the hallway at night asking for Arthur. It's heartbreaking, truly. The delusion is spreading." I sat in my leather armchair, a thick wool blanket draped over my lap. I didn't brush my hair. I allowed a faint, vacant glaze to settle over my eyes. I kept my hands folded, letting my left thumb press into the diamond trumkai tuck hidden in my palm, the sharp sting of the metal keeping my internal mind razor sharp, while my face remained a mask of senile compliance. I thought I heard his voice," I whispered, my voice intentionally thin, cracking at the edges. "He used to adjust that clock every Sunday. He said if the pendulum stopped, the house would go cold." Julian let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh, stepping forward to lean over my chair, his shadow completely blocking out the dim light from the desk lamp. "The house is already cold, Mother, because you're letting it rot. You're letting your mind drag this entire family asset into the dirt. Look at yourself. You're trembling. You can barely hold a teacup, let alone manage a multi-million-dollar trust portfolio." "David?" I turned my head slowly toward my old attorney, my movements deliberate and heavy. Is it true? Did you sign the papers? You told me my investments were secure." David Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie, his voice taking on a cold, clinical detachment that stripped 20 years of friendship into a business transaction. "Eleanor, as the independent trustee, my fiduciary duty is to protect the Caldwell estate. Given your documented cognitive decline, the water valve incident, the nighttime wandering, I had no choice but to concur with Julian and Meredith. Your short-term memory is non-existent. You are a danger to your own fortune. For your own protection, I've authorized the immediate transfer of control. He's right, Eleanor, Meredith sneered, stepping closer, her heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards. She reached down, grabbed the velvet lid of Arthur's music box from the side table, and slid it into her designer tote bag without asking. You are completely incapacitated. Your checkbook is frozen. Your credit lines are closed. You don't even have the legal authority to buy groceries on this island anymore. You are a ghost inside this house, and ghosts don't get to sign checks. The sheer arrogance of her words, the trow-trow of her actions as she stole my husband's token right in front of me, compressed the spring inside my chest to a dangerous, burning density. A normal mother would have wept, would have screamed at her son for letting this stranger strip her dignity. But I stayed silent. I let the humiliation wash over me, absorbing the gaslighting like a sponge, storing every word, every smirk, every micro-expression into the digital files of my memory. I wanted them to feel untouchable. I wanted their sense of victory to be so total that they would stop looking for the secondary tripwires. Where do you want me to sign? I murmured, letting my chin drop toward my chest, my body trembling violently under the wool blanket. Julian smirked, a triumphant, ugly twist of his lips as he took the heavy fountain pen from David's hand and forced it between my shaking fingers. Right here, Mother, on the asset transfer mandate. Sign the estate over to Meredith's corporate fund. Let us handle the Chicago debts. The county tax assessor. Stop fighting us. You've lost. Your mind is gone, and it's time to let the adults take over. I lowered my head, hiding the absolute, terrifying sharpness in my eyes behind a veil of messy gray hair. With a calculated, shaky stroke, I signed my name on the line, intentionally overlapping the cursive loops of the E and the C in a very specific, erratic manner. To Julian and Meredith, it looked like the signature of a dying woman whose nervous system was collapsing. To a forensic document examiner, it was a coded distress marker, a standard behavioral baseline indicating physical and psychological duress that would invalidate the document under federal fraud guidelines the moment it was presented to a real judge. Perfect, Meredith gasped, snatching the papers from the desk before the ink could even dry. She held them up to the light, her eyes reflecting a manic, desperate greed. It's over. We have the legal restructuring. Julian, call the transport team for tomorrow morning. We're moving her to the Boston Care Unit permanently. She doesn't need to be on this island anymore. They walked out of the library, their low whispers and triumphant laughter echoing through the hall before the front door slammed shut. The moment the lock clicked, the vacant glaze vanished from my eyes. I stood up from the armchair, the wool blanket falling to the floor, my posture snapping into the rigid, imposing silhouette of a federal judge. The tremors in my hand stopped instantly. I looked down at my thumb. A tiny drop of blood from the Tramkai tuck had stained my palm. I didn't wipe it away. It was a reminder of the price of admission. They thought they had just finalized the perfect white-collar execution, but their absolute arrogance had caused them to make a catastrophic, fatal oversight. During their 30-minute display of gaslighting, while Meredith was screaming in my face and Julian was leaning over my chair, I had utilized my 30 years of courtroom training to analyze their movements. Meredith's coat had been slightly damp at the hem, not from the island fog, but from heavy industrial road grime. More importantly, when Julian had reached into his pocket to pull out his phone, a small laminated security pass had slipped onto the rug for a fraction of a second before he kicked it under the sofa. After they left, I walked over to the sofa, knelt down, and pulled out the piece of plastic. It was an access badge for a private charter terminal at the New Bedford Regional Airport, dated for Monday morning at 6 a.m. The pieces of the true puzzle instantly locked into place. They weren't waiting until Monday at 9 a.m. to file the conservatorship at the local Dukes County courthouse. They were panicked because of Evelyn's sudden accident. They knew an investigation would eventually follow the hit and run. They were planning to fly out of New Bedford at dawn, skip the local jurisdiction entirely, and present the forged documents and my signed asset transfer to a compromised probate judge in Delaware, a state known for corporate anonymity, to finalize the liquidation of my $15 million portfolio before anyone could track the paper trail. They had altered the timeline, which meant I had to alter the execution of my trap. I pulled the hidden burner phone from the encyclopedia, dialed a number that bypassed the local state police entirely and connected directly to the office of the U.S. Trustee and the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI in Boston. The agent who answered was a man named Miller, a former investigator who had secured his first major conviction under my bench a decade ago. "Agent Miller," I said, my voice no longer a whisper, but the deep, commanding baritone that had once cleared entire rooms of high-priced defense lawyers. "This is Judge Eleanor Caldwell. I am currently under active chemical and financial duress by a corporate syndicate operating out of Chicago, coordinated by my son, Julian Caldwell, and my trustee, David Sterling. They have just obtained a signature under physical coercion and are intending to transport my assets across state lines via private charter flight out of New Bedford at 0600 hours tomorrow." There was a sharp gasp on the other end, followed by the rapid clacking of a computer keyboard. "Judge Caldwell? My God, we've been trying to verify your location for 48 hours. Justice Evelyn Vance's office left a secure encrypted file on our server before her accident, but the access keys were missing. We couldn't open the files without independent verification from you." I looked out the window at the approaching storm, a cold smile touching my lips. "The access key is the serial number of my husband's Tuici music box, which Meredith Caldwell has just stolen from my house. The digital video feeds from my study are embedded in that file. I have intentionally allowed them to freeze my accounts and take the signed transfer to create an undeniable, overt act of multi-state bank fraud and elder exploitation." "What do you want us to do, Your Honor?" Miller asked, his tone shifting from shock to absolute military readiness. "We can dispatch a field team to your estate right now." "No," I replied, my eyes hardening into iron. "If you move now, David Sterling will shred the primary financial ledge connecting Julian to the Chicago cartel. Let them take me to the transport van tomorrow morning. Let them drive me to the courthouse. Let them walk into that room believing they are finalizing a routine, unopposed conservatorship. I want the trap to snap shut when they are completely exposed, right in front of the bench, where there are no back exits and no corporate shields." "Understood, Judge Caldwell," Miller stated. "The federal warrants will be drafted by midnight. We will be waiting in the gallery." I hung up the phone, walked back to my armchair, and sat down in the dark. I picked up my garden hat from the floor and placed it back on the table. The next 12 hours would be a descent into purgatory. I would have to suffer their insults, walk into the transport vehicle looking like a broken vegetable, and face the ultimate public humiliation in front of my peers. But as the first raindrops began to hammer against the glass, the absolute certainty of my victory filled the quiet library. They thought they were rewriting the end of my life. They didn't realize they were just characters in an indictment that I had already finished writing. 7:15, the trigger, the day of reckoning. The day of reckoning arrived not with a whimper, but with the deafening roar of a federal ambush. The illusion of my defeat had been maintained to the millimeter, allowing Julian and Meredith to race headlong into their own execution. At exactly 6 a.m. on Monday, the private charter jet at New Bedford Regional Airport was grounded by a sudden, mandatory FAA clerical freeze, a quiet favor arranged by Agent Miller. Panicked and backed into a corner by their violent Chicago creditors, Julian, Meredith, and David Sterling had no choice but to pivot to their fallback plan, forcing an emergency permanent conservatorship hearing at the Savannah District Courthouse at 9 a.m. to legally liquidate my assets on the spot. They believed they were walking into an unopposed victory lap. They believed the broken old woman shuffling between two orderlies was a brain-dead vegetable. The trap was sprung the exact second the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4 slammed shut behind us. I sat at the defense table, my shoulders hunched, my chin pressed against my chest, clutched in the faded country clothes they had packed to humiliate me. Across the aisle, Meredith adjusted her designer navy suit, leaning over to whisper to Julian with an air of absolute, venomous triumph. "Look at her," she hissed, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "She doesn't even know what city she's in. The water valve was just the beginning, Julian. By noon, everything she owns belongs to us." Julian smirked, a hollow, arrogant twist of his lips. "It's over, Mother," he whispered loudly, leaning over the partition. "Your mind is gone, and it's time to let the adults take over." But the arrogance in the room withered into ash the moment Judge Gregory Mitchell stepped onto the elevated bench. The air inside the courtroom turned into a suffocating vacuum. As Judge Mitchell adjusted his dark-framed glasses and looked down at the defense table, his eyes connected with mine. The transformation was instantaneous and violently dramatic. The professional, sympathetic mask of a seasoned judge completely melted from his face. All the color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the sound block with a dull, echoing clatter that shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. He physically recoiled into his high-backed leather chair, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. "My God," Judge Mitchell whispered, his voice thin, breathless, and carrying across the silent chamber without the need for a microphone. "Is it really her?" The slick city litigator hired by Julian frowned in deep confusion, stepping forward with his arms raised. "Your Honor, is everything all right? Do we need to call a medical professional for the respondent? As we've clearly established in the medical filings, Eleanor Caldwell is suffering from irreversible cognitive decay." "Shut your mouth, counselor!" Judge Mitchell barked, his voice exploding like thunder across the vaulted ceiling. He leaned forward over the bench, ignoring every standard protocol of courtroom decorum, his eyes burning with an intense, palpable fear. "You have absolutely no idea who is sitting at that defense table. 30 years ago, I was a struggling, desperate law intern on the verge of disbarment. That woman sitting right there stepped in, took me under her wing, and saved my professional life. She is the most ruthless, brilliant, and honorable federal judge this state has ever seen." The courtroom froze. Julian's smirk was wiped completely off his face. Meredith stiffened, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the edge of the table until her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. "Furthermore," Judge Mitchell continued, his voice trembling with profound reverence, "she authored the very family and asset protection statutes you are currently attempting to use in my courtroom today. She wrote the emergency ex parte provisions you filed on Friday morning. Are you seriously standing there telling me that the architect of this state's financial protection laws has lost her mind?" The slick litigator took a step backward, his professional composure completely shattered. "Your Honor, we have signed affidavits from 2 out-of-state neurologists. We have the co-signature of her own legal trustee, David Sterling." "I don't care what papers you have in that binder," Judge Mitchell roared. This was the moment. The spring, compressed to its absolute limit through weeks of chemical poisoning, gaslighting, and humiliation, violently snapped open. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my head. I let the slumped curve of my spine straighten. I placed my hands flat on the defense table, stopping the fabricated tremors instantly. I drew my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and stood at my full height, radiating the terrifying, commanding majesty of a supreme judge. The helpless widow vanished. The apex predator was fully awake. "With the permission of the court," I said, my voice no longer a frail whisper, but a deep, resonant baritone that cut through the stillness like a finely sharpened blade. "I am formally requesting to waive my right to appointed counsel. I will be representing myself in this matter." Judge Mitchell did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Permission is unequivocally granted, Judge Caldwell. The floor is entirely yours." Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crash. Agent Miller of the FBI strode into the chamber, flanked by 4 armed federal marshals. Behind them, 2 paralegals pushed a heavy metal trolley burdened with 6 large, tightly packed banker's boxes. The wheels squeaked sharply against the floorboards, a chilling mechanical contrast to the frantic, terrified stares of my son and daughter-in-law. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my eyes locking onto David Sterling, who was trying to subtly slide his leather portfolio beneath his chair. "Let us address the incident with the upper water valve," I began, my tone dripping with a lethal, mocking calm. "And the shattered lifeline of my dear friend, Justice Evelyn Vance. Opposing counsel believes they executed the perfect crime. They believed that by having their Chicago syndicate orchestrate a hit-and-run on Evelyn's vehicle in Boston, they had destroyed my defense files. They believed that by tracking my movements, they had discovered my backup plans." I smiled, a cold, predatory stretch of my lips as I looked directly at Meredith. What you failed to realize, Meredith, is that a federal investigator never stores the primary indictment in a single briefcase. The leak of Evelyn's location was a deliberate breadcrumb I left for your shadow creditors. I wanted your syndicate to strike. I wanted them to intervene. Because the moment they touched a retired Supreme Court justice, they escalated a local inheritance dispute into a Tier 1 federal racketeering and terrorism investigation. Meredith let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, the blood completely draining from her face. You thought you were gaslighting me, I continued, stepping closer to the plaintiff's table, forcing Julian to face the cold, penetrating stare that had broken hardened cartel bosses. You told me my mind was rotting. You told me I couldn't remember turning off a faucet, but you forgot one crucial detail about the estate you were so desperate to steal. Every single room in that house is equipped with micro-surveillance cameras routed directly to a secure FBI server in Boston, a system I had installed the day after Arthur died for my own security. I didn't flush those antipsychotic pills down the toilet, Meredith. I kept them. And my federal surveillance team recorded you, frame by high-definition frame, pulling an unlabeled amber bottle from your purse, dissolving those neuroleptics into my Earl Grey tea, and smiling as you handed me the cup. G-O-D. I reached into the first banker's box and slammed a certified document onto the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the silent room. This is a comprehensive independent toxicology report, conducted covertly using hair follicle and blood analysis. It conclusively proves a systematic, daily ingestion of unprescribed chemical restraints. And this, I slammed a secondary sheet of paper directly in front of Meredith, is your corporate credit card statement, detailing a cash-equivalent transaction at an unregulated pharmacy in New Jersey 5 weeks ago. The dosage and timeline match perfectly. You didn't observe my mental decline, Meredith. You manufactured it. You poisoned your own husband's mother to fabricate the medical grounds for this court. Meredith clutched her throat, her chest heaving as she let out a piercing, high-pitched wail of absolute panic. She thrashed against her chair, her perfectly styled hair falling into a disheveled mess, looking exactly like the terrified, trapped animal she had believed me to be just minutes prior. I turned my focus onto David Sterling. And then we have my trusted trustee. David, you thought your signature on the asset transfer mandate was the final nail in my coffin. But if you look closely at the signature I executed last night, I projected the document onto the large courtroom monitors. The cursive loops of the E and the C are intentionally overlapped. Under the Federal Elder Exploitation and Banking Security Act, a statute I personally drafted 25 years ago, that specific erratic baseline is a legally coded duress marker. It doesn't validate the transfer, David. It automatically triggers an immediate, unbailable federal freeze on any financial entity attempting to clear it. David Sterling's briefcase slipped from his hand, crashing onto the polished floorboards, his face slick with a cold, greasy sweat. He sank into his seat, completely paralyzed, realizing he had just signed his own disbarment and a 10-year stretch in a federal penitentiary. The medical fraud was merely the key to unlock the vault, I announced to the paralyzed room, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. The true motivation sits right there. I pointed a stern, unyielding finger at my son. Julian Caldwell, you projected the image of a successful venture capitalist. In reality, your hedge fund is a bankrupt shell. You haven't made a profitable investment in 4 years. You currently owe $15 million to an illicit shadow banking syndicate operating out of Chicago, a violent organization that does not accept apologies for late payments. Julian was trembling violently now, the tailored charcoal suit he wore looking entirely too large for his shrinking frame. He opened his mouth, stammering nonsensical syllables, desperately searching for a lie that could save him. To save your own pathetic life, I whispered, my voice cutting through his stammers like a razor. You needed collateral. You needed my farm, my acreage, and my financial portfolios. When you couldn't convince me to sign them over, you and your wife stole the keys to my safe, photographed my deeds, and forged my signature on multiple loan guarantee documents to pledge my legacy to a cartel. The emergency conservatorship filed on Friday was your desperate attempt to finalize the legal transfer before the syndicate tore you apart. You were not protecting me, Julian. You were feeding your own mother to the wolves to save yourself. The arrogant city litigator Julian had hired didn't say a word. He frantically snapped his briefcase shut, abandoned his clients at the table, and literally sprinted toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber, desperate to escape the monumental criminal fallout. Julian looked at the monitor, where the raw, unedited 4K footage was now looping, showing him clearly kneeling on the antique Persian rug, cracking the combination dial of my safe, and photographing my bearer bonds. The proof was absolute. The digital reality was undeniable. The primal animalistic instinct to survive suddenly overrode any remaining shred of rational thought in Julian's mind. He looked at the federal marshals closing in, looked at his weeping wife, and completely snapped. With a violent, uncaring thrust, he forcefully shoved Meredith away, knocking her chair backward. She spilled onto the polished floorboards in a tangle of navy fabric and terrified sobs. Julian lunged forward, scrambling over the plaintiff's table, and bolted down the center aisle toward the exit. He was sprinting for his life, blinded by adrenaline, desperate to escape the immediate, crushing weight of federal prison. He didn't even make it halfway down the long aisle. Judge Mitchell slammed his gavel down, the sound ringing out like a thunderclap. "Marshals, secure that man immediately." The two largest federal marshals converged on Julian instantly with swift, practiced tactical precision. The lead officer hit him from the side with a punishing shoulder tackle, driving his body violently into the solid oak of the spectator benches. The impact knocked the wind completely out of Julian's lungs with a sickening hollow thud. He hit the polished floorboards hard, thrashing and kicking wildly in a blind, pathetic panic. But the officers were utterly relentless. They pinned his arms painfully behind his back, pressing his cheek roughly against the cold marble floor. The sharp, unmistakable ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs engaging echoed loudly through the chamber, finalizing his absolute, inescapable ruin. I stood tall behind the defense table, watching my treacherous son lie subdued and broken on the floor, his face covered in courtroom dust, while his wife wept uncontrollably at his side. The spring had completely uncoiled, and the law I had spent my entire life defending had finally delivered its ultimate, merciless judgment upon the architects of my suffering. 9:20, the resolution after the storm. The echoes of the final gavel strike lingered in the high-ceiling chamber of Courtroom 4, long after the federal marshals had dragged the remaining architects of my suffering out through the side exit. Order returned to the court with the quiet, methodical precision of a ticking clock. Judge Gregory Mitchell did not hesitate for a single second. With a swift stroke of his pen, he formally revoked the emergency ex parte conservatorship, declaring it null, void, and criminally fraudulent from the very moment of its inception. My legal autonomy, my fortune, and my name were restored to me completely. Bench warrants were immediately issued for the arrests of the two out-of-state neurologists, and David Sterling was escorted out in handcuffs by the state bar representatives. The legal armor I had spent 30 years forging had held against the storm. As I walked out of the Savannah District Courthouse, the heavy double wooden doors swung shut behind me, instantly muting the chaotic whispers of the courtroom gallery. The harsh, relentless rain that had battered the city all morning had finally begun to break, allowing a pale golden sunlight to pierce through the parting slate-gray clouds. The air felt clean, carrying the sharp, crisp scent of autumn and the distant salt of the Atlantic. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the last lingering traces of the chemical lethargy completely evaporate from my system. My posture remained straight, my stride measured and confident as I walked down the marble steps. For weeks, I had forced myself to become a shadow, shuffling my feet, letting my hands shake, and enduring the calculated psychological cruelty of my own flesh and blood just to build an airtight case. The humiliation was over. The performance was finished. I was no longer the bait inside a corporate trap. I was Eleanor Caldwell, and I was finally free. 2 days later, I returned to the absolute sanctuary of my estate in Martha's Vineyard. The island had settled into its quiet, off-season rhythm, the summer crowds long gone, leaving only the ancient cedar shingle homes and the rolling, frost-covered cliffs. I spent the first morning walking through the sweeping gardens Arthur and I had planted decades ago, listening to the rhythmic, comforting crash of the waves against the shore. The house was empty now, stripped of the toxic presence that had threatened to tear down its foundations. But it did not feel lonely. It felt peaceful. With the professional coordination of Agent Miller and the federal prosecutors, the legal proceedings concluded within 6 short months with devastating finality. Preston's venture capital firm was systematically dismantled, and his shadow banking debts to the Chicago syndicate were seized under federal anti-racketeering statutes. He was handed a maximum 15-year sentence in a high-security federal penitentiary. Meredith faced an equally merciless reckoning. Convicted of corporate fraud, forgery, and the attempted chemical imprisonment of a vulnerable senior, she was stripped of her licensing and sentenced to 12 years in a state correctional facility, completely isolated from the luxury and privilege she had poisoned me to protect. Their own reckless greed had been their ultimate undoing, a poison far more potent than anything they had ever slipped into my evening tea. I chose not to keep the wealth they had tried so desperately to steal. Working closely with federal estate planners, I established a bulletproof, asset-protected legal trust under Arthur's name. The vast majority of my financial portfolio and the future deed to the estate were transferred into this protected entity, specifically designed to fund high-powered legal defenses and emergency protective services for vulnerable elderly citizens trapped in abusive, fraudulent conservatorships. I ensured that the exact statutes I had written to protect the innocent could never again be weaponized by financial predators. It is now a crisp, quiet morning in early November. The sun is just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of the vineyard, casting long, amber shadows across the frozen grass. I am standing on the wooden planks of my back porch, holding a steaming mug of fresh, untainted black coffee. I reach into my pocket, pull out Arthur's antique Swiss mechanical music box, and gently lift the velvet lid. The delicate, flawless mechanics spin into motion, and the elegant notes of the opera solo fill the morning air, lifting up into the wind. I look out at the horizon, closing my eyes, finally and completely at peace. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family. True security does not lie in the vast wealth we accumulate or the legacies we leave behind, but in the strict boundaries we have the courage to enforce. Forgiveness is indeed a virtue, but absolute accountability is a necessity. Never mistake a person's quiet patience for weakness. An old lioness may rest in the shade, but her mind remains a scalpel, and the truth will always burn away the deepest shadows of deceit. If this story of justice and survival kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling Kitschban. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How would you have handled Julian and Meredith if you discovered your own family was plotting against you? Like this video to bring a little sunshine to this mother's victorious heart, and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Thank you for listening.
Câu chuyện để lại một bài học sâu sắc về gia đình và công lý. Máu mủ chỉ định hình mối quan hệ, nhưng sự trung thành và lòng tôn kính mới tạo nên một gia đình thực sự. Đừng bao giờ nhầm lẫn sự nhẫn nhịn và im lặng của người già là yếu đuối. Bởi một con sư tử già, dù nghỉ ngơi trong bóng râm, thì móng vuốt và trí tuệ của nó vẫn vô cùng sắc bén. Trong cuộc sống, tha thứ là một đức tính tốt, nhưng sự minh bạch và thượng tôn pháp luật là điều kiện kiên quyết để bảo vệ bản thân. Cuối cùng, bóng tối của sự dối trá và lòng tham vọng bất chính sẽ luôn bị thiêu rụi trước ánh sáng của công lý và lòng kiên định.